Welcome back. We're going to continue our discussion about how to write a rhetorical analysis essay. We're focusing specifically on the FIDDS today. Let's remember a couple of things before we get going. When you're writing an analysis essay, you're going to use the author's name a lot. Remember, an analysis is ultimately an essay that discusses how an author uses language in order to create a particular effect. So ultimately the essay is about the author and what the author is doing. The other side of that is that you need to make sure that you refer to the audience regularly. After all, the author is trying to create an effect on the audience. So we need to talk about the author and the audience, and the audience's reactions to the author's decisions. In doing that, you're going to do a lot better job of this if you can answer a series of questions when you talk about specific things that the author does. So ultimately, when you talk about different techniques, you're going to talk about these kinds of things. What is the intended effect on the audience of a provided example or technique that you're talking about? How does this technique or strategy usually work? How is that strategy working in your specific example? Why did the author use this particular strategy on this particular audience? How is the audience supposed to feel? What is the audience supposed to think? And finally, in what way does this stylistic device enhance the overall message? If you can answer some of these questions when you're discussing some example that the author uses, you're going to be in great shape. This series of videos has focused on the FIDDS. Earlier videos focused on figurative language, imagery, diction, and syntax. Now we're going to focus on details and how a writer uses specific details to create a particular effect. Authors, of course, make a number of decisions when they are writing. One of the things that they do is they make the decision as to what details they're going to include in specific portions of their text and what details they're not going to include. So what we're going to look at specifically here, we're going to look at their use of nouns or proper nouns. That's the kind of details we're talking about here. So details are the specific nouns or proper nouns that the speaker or the writer uses in his or her piece. Details are specifically described items placed in a work for effect and meaning. When we talk about diction, we're generally talking about verbs and adjectives. But when we refer to details, we're talking about nouns. So that's the big difference between your discussion of details as opposed to diction. So let's take a look at an article written in 2002 by Suzanne Burns for the New York Times. The article is called Where Nothing Says Everything, and it's an article that was written several months after the World Trade Center catastrophe in New York City in 2001. So it starts off, on a cold, damp March morning, I visited Manhattan's financial district, a place I'd never been, to pay my respects at what used to be the World Trade Center. Many other people had chosen to do the same that day, despite the raw wind and spits of rain, and so the first thing I noticed when I arrived on the corner of Vesey and Church Streets was a crowd. So this particular essay, I won't read the whole thing for you, although it's excellent and you should check it out. This whole essay is about her experiences traveling to the site of the World Trade Center catastrophe. She went to Ground Zero. And later on in the essay, she points out a whole bunch of things and uses details to create a particular effect. Here's a two-paragraph section of her essay that's particularly interesting. I'll read it to you and then we'll talk about it. Suddenly you notice the periphery, the skyscraper shrouded in black plastic, the boarded windows, the steel skeleton, and the shattered winter garden. Suddenly there are the broken steps and cracked masonry in front of Brooks Brothers. Suddenly there are the firefighters, the waiting ambulance on the other side of the pit, the police on every corner. Suddenly there is the enormous cross made of two rusted girders. And suddenly, very suddenly, there is the little cemetery attached to St. Paul's Chapel, with tulips coming up, the chapel and grounds miraculously undamaged except for a few plastic-sheathed gravestones. The iron fence is almost invisible beneath a welter of dried pine wreaths, banners, ribbons, laminated poems and prayers and photographs, swags of paper cranes, withered flowers, baseball hats, rosary beads, teddy bears, and flags, flags everywhere, little American flags fluttering in the breeze, flags on posters drawn by brownie troops, flags on t-shirts, flags on hats, flags streaming by tied to the handles of baby strollers. So this is a pretty interesting section by Suzanne Byrne where she includes a lot of details. There are a lot of nouns, of things we're supposed to be looking at, things we're supposed to be hearing, things we're supposed to be smelling, all of these kinds of items that we're focused on, so details. So in this first paragraph, you notice that she starts talking about the skyscraper, and she mentioned the cracked masonry, and she mentions the front of a store. She talks about the firefighters and the ambulance. You probably notice in the second paragraph she starts focusing in on a cemetery, and in that cemetery we have tulips, and she does mention gravestones, but then she starts to mention all of these different items that pop up. So we've got wreaths and banners and ribbons and poems and prayers and photographs, and then you see in this last section she mentions flags a number of times in this particular section. So flags and flags and more flags. So lots of details. So let's take a look at how someone might write an analysis for this particular section on the details that Byrne uses. So here's one way to do it. Ultimately, this is the exact same thing that we've talked about in previous videos when analyzing diction or analyzing figurative language. Ultimately, you need to think about how are audience members typically going to react to the words that have been chosen for this particular section. If we can think that way, you can write a pretty good analysis. So here, it's going to start off by pointing to some specific sections and then identifying the type of evidence that's being pointed out, and then how the audience is supposed to react to this. So let's take a look. It says, situated next to the dreary details of destruction along the street, the description of the cemetery is notable. When characterizing this little cemetery, she takes a moment to point out the tulips coming up and the miraculously undamaged grounds. Okay, so we've started this off by providing examples. Okay? Again, you don't have to write about these things in a scripted order. So one of the things that has to be done is that you have to directly quote things from the passage anytime you're analyzing. Okay. Now the next sentence says, the inclusion of these details is no mere accident. So here this writer has identified what he or she is specifically going to talk about. In this case, it's the details, the nouns that Suzanne Byrne has used in her piece. Okay. And we continue. Byrne knows that readers typically associate cemeteries with death and misery, mourning and loss. Okay, so this is answering that question. How is this typically done? And so what's typically done when you talk about cemeteries is to talk about death and tombs and those kinds of things. This creates a good segue into the analysis. However, she doesn't focus on grieving mothers or dusty tombs. She points to blooming flowers and lush landscaping. Byrne obviously wants readers to notice that life Notice the life that exists among so much death, a theme that she is focusing on within her essay as a whole. Even in the darkest places, whether it is a cemetery or the site of one of America's worst tragedies, hope still exists. So this writer has done a great job of talking about why these particular word choices, these particular details, the tulips coming up, the undamaged grounds, these details are effective. What do these particular details elicit from the audience? Well, most of the time, this writer says, when you think of cemeteries, you think about these sorts of things, death and misery. But this writer has pointed out that that's not the angle that Byrne is going for here. Instead, she talks about all these kind of positive things like flowers and miracles. And so then at the very end, this writer answers that last question, how does all of this apply to her overall purpose? And that purpose, if you read the whole piece, certainly has to do with hope. Okay, I hope this helped.